The room had gone very quiet. Not the ordinary quiet that followed a verdict, the shuffling of plum-coloured robes, the scratch of Percy Weasley's quill finally going still, the Wizengamot members turning to one another with the professionally restrained satisfaction of people who could see their lunches from here. This was different. This was the quiet of a room that had not yet been told it was going to have to stay. Amelia Bones had learned, over 40 years, to read the quality of silence in a room she was responsible for. Courtroom 10 held many kinds: solemn ones, frightened ones, the particular suspended breath of a man who has just heard his sentence and has not decided what to do with his face. She had been present for most of the significant ones. The chamber was unchanged around her, the torches in their brackets, the tiers of Wizengamot seats rising above the stone floor, the single chair at the centre with its associated chains, currently coiled. It was a room designed to contain things. She had always found that appropriate. The boy was 15 years old and he had just been cleared. He sat in that chair, the chains dormant, as they were when they had no one to restrain, and he was looking at his hands. He was thin in the way that raised questions if you were in the habit of asking them. 2 large robes, a piece of tape at the bridge of his glasses, the slightly hunched posture of a child accustomed to taking up as little space as possible. She had watched him testify about invisible creatures in a suburban alley with the same steadiness he might have used to describe the weather, and she had thought, this is not a boy who dramatizes. She had the transcript before her. Percy Weasley's notation was, as always, immaculate. The testimony of one Arabella Fig, Squib, of Wisteria Walk, Little Whinging, Surrey, occupied 11 pages. She had watched Harry Potter for 15 years on Dumbledore's orders. She had lived 2 streets from the boy's front door. She had babysat him through the 80s and into the early 90s, and had never once notified any ministry authority, because no ministry authority had ever thought to ask. The transcript noted, with Weasley's characteristic brevity, that Mrs. Fig had found it difficult and regretted it. The regret, Amelia thought, was not quite the issue. 15 years. Cornelius Fudge, through the small circle of her monocle, was already gathering himself, and Amelia spoke before he could. The exoneration stands. Her voice in courtroom 10 carried the way it always had. Not raised, not performed. Simply the voice of a woman who had been expected to speak authoritatively in rooms like this one for long enough that the expectation had become fact. The charge against Harry James Potter, under the decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery, is dismissed in full. The record will reflect that the Patronus charm cast on the 2nd of August, 1995, was necessary and justified in defense of life. She set the transcript down with both hands, flat on the table. However, the word landed in the room the way certain facts did, not loudly, but with the quality of something irrevocable. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement is opening a separate inquiry into the circumstances of Harry James Potter's placement with the Dursley family of 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, on or about the 1st of November, 1981. Into who arranged that placement, and on what authority. Into what conditions were maintained at that address during the years of his minority, and what was known of those conditions by which parties. And into why no ministry body was informed, at any point, in 14 years. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. She watched the room the way she had spent 40 years learning to watch rooms. Fudge's expression moved through discomfort, and then, faster than she would have liked, into something recognizable as calculation, an inquiry that might implicate Albus Dumbledore in poor judgment about the most famous child in Wizarding Britain, one Fudge hadn't requested, and therefore couldn't be blamed for having requested. The political geometry suited him. He did not move to stop it. Dumbledore was standing to the left of the boy's chair, his hands folded inside his robes. He was very still. He did not protest. After a long moment, he said quietly, "Shall I be summoned?" "All parties with documented knowledge of the placement will be summoned in turn," Amelia said. He inclined his head. His expression was composed, and, she observed with some unease, entirely unsurprised. She had been prepared for resistance, or at minimum for the dignified version of protest that Dumbledore deployed in Wizengamot chambers. The absence of both told her something she would spend a great deal of the coming weeks considering. The boy was looking at Dumbledore. She had been watching Harry Potter throughout the proceedings, not with any particular intensity, simply with the attention she gave to anyone for whom a proceeding was about more than procedure. He was looking at the old man with an expression she couldn't precisely name. It was not quite bewilderment, and not quite something else she wasn't yet ready to name. He was waiting, she thought, to be told what something meant. He was 15 years old. He had very green eyes. He had just been cleared of a charge that should never have been brought. And now something else was happening around him in the language she spent her life inside, and he had never been required to learn. Dumbledore did not look back at him. She noted that, and set it alongside everything else she had collected in this room today. "The formal scope of the inquiry," Amelia said, returning her attention to the parchment, to the procedural ground that was, after 40 years, a kind of home, "covers 3 questions. Who made the decision to place Harry James Potter with the Dursley family, and under what authority? What conditions were maintained at 4 Privet Drive during his minority, and what knowledge of those conditions was held and by whom? And whether any ministry department received any notification regarding his placement or welfare at any point between 1981 and the present day. The inquiry is the first of its kind." The last was simply true. The wizarding world had no child welfare authority and had never thought to build one. That absence would be in her findings, whether or not anyone in this room found it convenient. The session closed 14 minutes later. Fudge left quickly, already composing something in the set of his jaw that he would say to someone in a corridor before the day was out. Dumbledore spoke quietly to the boy. She could not hear the words. And then Harry Potter walked out of courtroom 10, and the door swung shut behind him, and the torches wavered in the draught, and the room was empty. Amelia gathered her papers. Edgar had been 28 when they killed him. His wife had been 26. The dark mark had hung above the house for 3 days before anyone came close enough to report it, because in the last months of the war, no one in the vicinity had been certain it was safe to approach anything that might look like a target. She had been the one to file the official report. She had used the language she always used, precise, procedural, stripped of the things that would have undone her, and then she had gone home and not slept for a week. She knew what it cost to be famous for surviving something terrible. Her family had produced both, the ones who had made it through and the ones who hadn't. She knew what it meant to be remembered as a symbol of something larger than yourself, and she knew, with the particular certainty of someone who had watched it happen from the outside, that symbols didn't have childhoods. Symbols didn't sleep in cupboards. What had happened to Harry Potter at 4 Privet Drive wasn't a symbol. It was 14 years, and someone was going to account for them. A child could not simply be placed somewhere and forgotten. She had believed that for 40 years, and she was not going to stop now because the person responsible happened to be Albus Dumbledore. She tucked the transcript under her arm, the monocle catching the guttering torchlight as she turned, and walked out into the stone corridor. There was always a next case. There was always another file on the desk. But this one, she thought, she was going to see through. The house always knew. before he did. Sirius Black had not chosen to believe that 12 Grimmauld Place was sentient, because he knew objectively that it wasn't. But after 35 years it had become difficult to maintain the distinction between a house that felt things and a house that had absorbed enough human feeling to start generating it on its own. He had grown up inside these walls, and then he had run from them at 16 and not looked back, and then he had been away from them for 12 years in a place where walls meant something entirely different, and now he was here again, and trapped again, and the house pressed on him with the particular comfort of something he had never wanted to come home to. He was in the kitchen when Harry came back. The kitchen of 12 Grimmauld Place was the one room that felt like something other than a monument to the family he had spent his life fleeing. Gas lamps, a long table, the old fireplace with its uneven burn. It smelled of burnt toast because Mrs. Weasley had made toast at 7 in the morning, and it had remained warmly in the air ever since. Sirius had been sitting at the table since 9, with a cup of tea gone cold, and a copy of the Daily Prophet he was not reading. He had ignored 3 offers of food. The clock on the wall said nearly noon. The hearing had started at 9. If something had gone badly, they would have sent word. The absence of word could be good news or bureaucratic delay, and he was not constitutionally suited to sitting still in the gap between those 2 possibilities. Then the front door opened, then footsteps on the stairs. Harry appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Sirius read his face before he opened his mouth. Cleared. He was certain of it before a word was said. He'd been able to do this with James who wore everything on his face for anyone who knew where to look, and Harry had the same quality, that particular transparency of someone who felt things too fully to manage a performance. Cleared. And then, underneath it, something else. "I was cleared," Harry said. "Good." Sirius said it quietly. The something else was still there. "What's the rest of it?" Harry came in and sat down. He looked for a moment like a person trying to find the beginning of something that had no obvious one. "They're opening an inquiry," he said, "into my placement with the Dursleys. Who arranged it? Who knew? Why the ministry was never told. Bones, the woman who cleared me, she just kept going. After the exoneration, she said it was the first inquiry of its kind. He said it the way he said most things that had surprised him badly, at a careful distance, as though reporting on someone he happened to know rather than on himself. Sirius had noticed this about him over the past weeks. Harry treated his own history as something other people were more entitled to be upset about than he was. Sirius sat down. He found the chair behind him and sat. He put both hands flat on the table. He thought about Arabella Fig's name in a transcript and Dumbledore's instructions and all the things any competent inquiry would surface in the first fortnight. And then he thought about the question any such inquiry would eventually reach, as inevitably as water finding a crack. Why was Harry not placed with his godfather? He was the godfather. He had been named as such formally, years before Harry was born, in writing, in the way James did everything that mattered to him. He had been proud of it, in the careless way of someone too young to imagine needing to be. And then James and Lily were killed, and he had gone to Godric's Hollow in the dark, and found Hagrid there with the baby, and he had wanted to take Harry himself, had felt it as something very close to a right, and Hagrid had said, Dumbledore's orders, firmly, kindly, and there was nothing in the world immovable in quite the same way as Hagrid's kindness, and Sirius had handed over his motorcycle, and that had been the last he'd seen of either of them for 12 years, because by the morning after that, he had been in ministry custody for something he hadn't done. No trial, just the word of Muggle witnesses and Bartemius Crouch, and a cell in Azkaban, and 12 years in the dark learning what cold was in its absolute sense, and the Ministry had filed his name under murderer and left it there. The inquiry would find his name. It would find him still a fugitive. It would find that he had gone to Azkaban the same night Harry had gone to Privet Drive, and it would ask someone to explain that. "Sirius!" He looked up. Lupin was in the doorway, leaning slightly against the frame. He had not made a sound on the stairs. He was watching both of them with his particular expression, tired, careful, 3 thoughts held at once, and he directed the question at Harry. "Do you know who will be summoned?" "All parties with documented knowledge of the placement," Harry said. "In turn." That was how she said it. Lupin nodded slowly. He came in and sat down across from Sirius. He folded his hands on the table, a gesture Sirius recognized. Lupin folded his hands when he didn't want them to grip. "They'll find your name in the record, the motorcycle, that you were there. They'll ask why he wasn't placed with me," Sirius said. "Yes." Just the one word. Lupin said it the way he said difficult things, directly, without softening, because softening them was, in his view, a form of disrespect. "They will." The kitchen was quiet for a while. The gas lamps made their small, steady sounds. Upstairs, Molly's footsteps moved back and forth with their particular, purposeful rhythm, and none of that reached the 3 of them at the table. By dinner the news had reached everyone in the house. Arthur Weasley sat at the long table with his hands around his cup, and his eyes somewhere in the direction of the middle distance, not quite landing anywhere. Molly had pressed her mouth into a thin line. She looked at Harry twice during the meal, and both times looked away before he could catch her at it, which was not like her. Fred and George, who could generally be relied upon to find an angle on anything, sat together at the far end of the table and said nothing, which was sufficiently unusual that Sirius kept glancing at them. Ron sat next to Harry and tried several things to say, and abandoned each of them. Hermione sat on Harry's other side and said nothing at all, which was different. It meant she had already thought of something and decided the timing wasn't right. Harry ate 3 bites and moved food around his plate for the remainder of the meal. He went upstairs early, and Sirius watched him go. The room Harry shared with Ron was dark when he got there, Ron still downstairs. He didn't light the lamp. He sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees and tried to work out what he was supposed to feel, and found that he couldn't locate a starting point. The inquiry was going to ask about his placement, about the cupboard, probably, about the Dursleys, about who had known and how much. Someone official was going to write it all into a ministry document. He hadn't asked for that. He hadn't asked for any of it. He'd shown up to a hearing to keep from being expelled, and this had come out the other end of it, and he didn't know yet how to feel about someone deciding that his childhood was evidence. He only knew that it was the first time he could remember that someone in an official capacity had looked at the facts of the matter and appeared to consider them unacceptable. He wasn't sure if that was what he'd always wanted, or simply something he'd never thought to want, because wanting it had seemed so remote as to be meaningless. He sat on the bed for a long time. By the time Ron came up, he hadn't worked it out. Sirius didn't sleep that night. He ended up in the front sitting room on the ground floor. His mother's room, dark green wallpaper, a chair that had faced the curtained window for 30 years and watched the street outside see nothing of what lay within. He sat in it and let the house settle. He thought about how his name appeared in official ministry records. He had been in Azkaban. He had escaped. He was still, technically, a wanted man. Every ministry document that contained his name began with what he was suspected of, what he had been convicted of without trial, what the warrant said. He was not summoned to things. He was searched for. He was not consulted. He was hunted. Tonight, a woman in a courtroom had asked, officially, on the record, why Harry's godfather had not been given the child. It was not exoneration. It was not justice. Not even close. It was a question in a document that contained his name as a possible right answer, as the answer to something, rather than as an accusation. For the first time in 14 years. He sat with that in the dark, in his mother's chair, in the house he had spent his adolescence trying to escape, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that it was enough to stay awake for. The summons arrived on a Tuesday. Arabella Fig had been expecting it since the hearing, since she had stood in courtroom 10 with her 11 pages and said the things she had been carrying for 15 years, and watched a woman in plum robes write all of it down with a face that suggested she intended to do something with what she had been given. She had taken the night bus home that night and sat in her kitchen with Tibbles on her lap and thought, "It will not stop there. It is not the sort of thing that stops." The summons was on ministry parchment, sealed, addressed in purple ink. It lay on the doormat for an hour before she picked it up. Snowy investigated it first, then lost interest. Mr. Paws walked across it twice. Tufty sat on the hall bench and watched Arabella with the expression cats wore when they had already decided how a thing would go. She read it standing in the hall with her dressing gown still on. Then she put it on the kitchen table and made a pot of tea and read it again. The formal scope of the inquiry was described in 3 enumerated points. Her name appeared in the 3rd paragraph. Mrs. Arabella Doreen Fig, squib of Wisteria Walk, Little Whinging, Surrey, in her capacity as appointed watcher for the minor Harry James Potter, pursuant to instructions given by Professor Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, Order of Merlin, First Class. She was required to attend in person on the 14th day of August, 1995. She had expected it. She had expected it for more than a week. It still hit her somewhere behind the breastbone. She had lived on Wisteria Walk for 15 years. She had watched, and she had reported, and she had done exactly what she was told. She finished her tea. She went upstairs and put on her good blouse. She forgot to change her slippers. It was not clear, even to Arabella herself, whether the forgetting was an accident. By the time she noticed, on the night bus, looking down at the faded blue wool on her feet while the bus lurched through 3 London postcodes in quick succession, she had already decided she was not going back. The carpet slippers were comfortable. She was 67 years old, and she was going to tell the truth to a ministry inquiry, and she was going to do it in her own shoes. The room was not courtroom 10. It was smaller, more functional, a table rather than tiers of seats, 3 chairs on the far side, a single lamp that illuminated without warmth. The stone walls were the same stone as everywhere in the ministry's lower levels, dark and close, and the door shut behind her with the particular quiet of a place that took its own proceedings seriously. Amelia Bones was already seated, a quill laid parallel to an open document. Beside her was the unnamed DMLE scribe, parchment ready. On Arabella's side of the table, 1 chair. She sat down. Bones said, "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Fig. I want to be clear that you are here as a witness, not as a suspect. The record will reflect that you cooperated fully with this inquiry's initial hearing, and your presence today is voluntary. You may stop at any time and request a break." Arabella had not expected that. She said, "I understand. Then let's begin with how you came to live in Little Whinging." It took 90 minutes to say the things that had taken 15 years to accumulate, and Arabella said them in the order in which they were asked, and she tried to say them the way she had spent her adult life learning to say difficult things, plainly, without ornament, without looking for the version that made her seem better than she was. She told Bones about the instructions. Dumbledore had come to her in late 1981, personally, not by owl, and explained what he needed. Someone in the vicinity who would not attract attention. A squib, undetectable by ministry magic tracing instruments, who could watch the boy without compromising the protections around the Dursley house. She had known Dumbledore for 30 years. She had said yes. She described the assignment. Watch Harry Potter. Report any threats to Dumbledore. Do not reveal herself as wizarding adjacent to the Dursleys or to the boy. Keep her distance. Keep her eyes open. Keep her mouth shut. She had followed those instructions for 15 years without deviation, reporting to Dumbledore 3 or 4 times a year, and she believed she was doing something necessary and protective. And she was telling this to Bones now in the same flat voice with which she said most things, and she could hear how it sounded. She told Bones about the babysitting. This was harder. She had made herself dull and slightly oppressive, the photographs of her cats displayed prominently, the lumpy sofa uncushioned. Nothing unkind, but nothing pleasant either. Nothing that would make Harry look forward to being there and make the Dursleys decide to keep him home instead. She was aware it made her sound cold. She wanted Bones to know she hadn't been cold, and she was not sure how to say that without it sounding like an excuse. She said, "I found it difficult, every time." And she said it once, and did not repeat it. She told Bones what she had seen of his conditions. The clothes, always Dudley's things, too large, worn thin at the elbows. The way he ate when she gave him food, the particular speed of a child who was not sure when the next meal was coming. He had been thin in a way that was not simply slight, a thin that made you look twice, that you noticed the way you noticed something missing from a familiar picture. She had seen that too, and she had reported it to Dumbledore, and Dumbledore had said the protections required him to remain at that address, and she had accepted that, and she had gone home, and she had not told anyone else. Bones made a note. She did not look up while she made it. "Mrs. Fig," she said, when she had finished writing, "did you at any point consider reporting Harry's conditions to the Ministry of Magic?" "No." "To the Auror office?" "No." "To any Muggle authority? Social services? A school? A doctor?" "No." Arabella's hands were folded on the table in front of her. She kept them still. Dumbledore's instructions were specific. No ministry contact. The magical protection on the house required secrecy. I understood that. And you trusted his judgment on that point. "I trusted his judgment," she said, "on everything." A pause. "For 15 years. Bones wrote something else. The scribe's quill moved steadily. The lamp made its small, steady glow. "One more question," Bones had said. She set her quill down parallel to the parchment, the same way she had placed it at the beginning. "Did Harry, in any of the years you watched him, did he ever seem frightened in his aunt and uncle's house?" The room was very quiet. Arabella Fig had sat in this chair for 90 minutes, and she had answered every question as quickly and completely as she could, and she had not paused like this before now, and she did not quite know why she was pausing, except that the question had the quality of something that couldn't be unsaid once she answered it, and it deserved a moment. She thought about the boy at the gate, the particular stillness of him when a car turned into Privet Drive, the way he laughed with friends outside of the Dursleys' sight, and how different that was from the way he held himself indoors. She thought about the word frightened, and what it covered, and what it left out. "Yes," she said. Bones nodded once. She did not write anything for a moment. Then she wrote. The session closed shortly after. Arabella was given a copy of her signed testimony and shown out by the scribe through a corridor she did not recognize, back to the lifts and the atrium and the golden statues she had always found faintly wrong, and then outside into the August heat and the sounds of central London. She did not take the night bus home. It was late afternoon by the time she got back to Wisteria Walk. The light was long and flat on the pavement. Tibbles was in the front window. She did not take the short way home. She walked the long route through the estate, down past the houses with their identical trim gardens and their net curtains, past the bus stop where Harry had waited sometimes on his way to school, past the junction at Magnolia Crescent. The alley was there, at the junction's far corner, the entrance shadowed. She walked past it at the same pace she walked everywhere, without stopping, without hurrying. She turned down Wisteria Walk. She had done what she could. She had done what she was told. She had believed, for 15 years, that those two things were the same, and she was no longer certain they were, and she was not sure, walking up her own front path with her cats watching from the window, what you were supposed to do with the distance between them. She let herself in. Snowy came to greet her. The house smelled of yesterday's soup. She put the kettle on and sat down and waited for it to boil. The letter arrived on the 28th of August, 4 days before term. Dumbledore read it twice at his desk in the headmaster's office, with Fawkes watching from his perch and the portraits feigning sleep the way they did when they were paying most careful attention. The letter was from the DMLE inquiry, and it was courteous and formal, and it informed him that Rubeus Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, had been formally summoned to provide testimony on the events of the 1st of November, 1981. A copy of the testimony would be shared with relevant parties in due course. He set the letter down. He could, he supposed, speak to Hagrid before the testimony. Prepare him. Suggest which questions to answer in full, and which to answer carefully. Hagrid was loyal, fiercely, unquestioningly loyal, and if Albus asked him to be quiet about certain aspects of that night, Hagrid would be quiet. He would not understand why, but he would do it. Dumbledore did not move for a long time. Then he folded the letter, placed it in the correct drawer, and went to the window and looked out over the grounds, which were green and quiet in the late August sun. He did not have that right. He had made certain choices about Harry's life under the shelter of arguments that he had, at the time, believed entirely. Those arguments remained available to him. The protection of the blood, the necessity of secrecy, the greater threat that required a boy to survive intact to a moment Dumbledore could not yet name for anyone, including the boy himself. All of it still held, internally. It was entirely consistent. He was not going to use Hagrid's loyalty to silence him, and he was not going to explain to himself why that was different from the other things he had done. Not today. He watched the grounds until the sun moved, and then he went to review the curriculum schedules for the new term, and he did not speak to Hagrid before the appointment. The inquiry room was on the second sub-level of the DMLE offices, and the chair provided for witnesses was a standard ministry-issue chair, which meant it had been designed with no human being over 6 feet in mind, and certainly not one over 11. Rubeus Hagrid sat in it anyway, or sat around it, his enormous frame engulfing the thing so completely that it was visible only as a slight elevation beneath him, and he held his hands in his lap because there was nowhere else to put them, and he looked at Amelia Bones across the table with his beetle-black eyes and the expression of determined cooperation that would have been legible from the far end of a Quidditch pitch. He was 66 years old. He had been at Hogwarts for 49 of those years. Boy and man, expelled and reinstated, and still there, still on the grounds, still carrying keys the size of his fist and talking to creatures the way other people talked to old friends. He had a black beard that had never in living memory been less than very large, and hands that could close around a cauldron, and he was sitting in a ministry chair and trying to be helpful, which was the state in which Hagrid approached most of the world most of the time. Bones introduced herself and the scope of the inquiry, and began. He described the night of the 1st of November, 1981, in the way Hagrid described most things, directly, without strategy, with a great deal of emotional weight sitting just under the words. He had gone to Godric's Hollow on Dumbledore's orders. The house had been... He paused, and his hands tightened briefly in his lap. It had been destroyed. Voldemort had been there. James and Lily were dead. He found the baby in the rubble, not badly hurt, crying. He had taken him. He had borrowed the motorcycle from Sirius Black earlier that evening. Sirius had been there, had arrived at Godric's Hollow too, shortly after Hagrid. Sirius had been. Hagrid stopped and searched for the right word, and settled on very upset. Very upset in the particular way of someone who has lost something enormous and is still in the first minutes of understanding that. The quill paused. Bones said, "Mr. Hagrid, you said you borrowed the motorcycle from Sirius Black. Can you clarify the nature of Mr. Black's presence at Godric's Hollow that night?" "He came to find... well, he came because James was his best friend." Hagrid said it simply. "And Harry, Sirius was Harry's godfather. He come because... I think he wanted to." He stopped again. "He wanted to take Harry. He asked me. He said he should be the one." Bones set her quill down, flat on the table. "Sirius Black asked to take Harry Potter himself. That evening." "Yes. And what was your response?" Hagrid's expression was, for a moment, very difficult to look at. "I told him no. I had to. I had Dumbledore's orders. Harry was to go to his aunt and uncle. That was where he was to go. Dumbledore had been very clear. I told Sirius I was sorry, and he gave me the motorcycle. He said to take it, and I took Harry, and I went." He paused. "I always wondered if I'd done right, telling him no like that. But Dumbledore's instructions were very clear." The scribe wrote steadily. Bones was looking at Hagrid with the particular focused attention of someone who has just received something significant. "Mr. Hagrid," she said, "I want to be certain the record is accurate. Sirius Black, Harry Potter's godfather, was present at Godric's Hollow on the night of the 1st of November, 1981, wished to take responsibility for the child, and was refused on Dumbledore's orders, and the child was then transported by you to the Dursley home instead. That's what happened. Was any reason given for why Mr. Black was not to be given the child?" Hagrid looked at his hands. "No, just that Harry was to go where Dumbledore said." Bones made a note. Then she said gently, "Thank you, Mr. Hagrid. I think that covers the main questions. I may have some follow-up in writing." Hagrid nodded and got up from the chair. It emerged from beneath him, considerably flattened, and pulled his enormous moleskin coat back around his shoulders and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, very nearly filling it. "He'll be all right, won't he said. "Harry." "That's rather what we're trying to establish," Bones said. Hagrid nodded, slowly, and left. The room was quiet. The scribe put down his quill. Bones sat for a moment with the document in front of her, and the record of what she now knew, which was, Harry Potter had had a designated godfather. That godfather had been on the scene on the night of the 1st of November, 1981. He had offered to take the child. He had been refused, and for reasons that were not yet formally in this record but were beginning to take shape, the child had been placed with Muggle relatives at a Surrey address instead. Sirius Black was a fugitive. He was a convicted murderer. Convicted without trial, she noted, which was a separate matter that the inquiry would need to address carefully, and which was currently outside its formal scope, but increasingly difficult to leave outside it. His testimony, if it became necessary, would require resolving his legal status first. The scope of the inquiry had just widened. She wrote for another 20 minutes, and then called in the next item. The second letter reached Hogwarts on the 3rd of September, 2 days into term. Dumbledore read it in the 15 minutes between the end of the welcome feast and his first obligations of the new school year. It was brief. The inquiry formally notified him that the question of Harry Potter's designated godfather and the events surrounding the placement of the 1st of November, 1981, had been opened as a line of inquiry and would be pursued in separate sessions. He would be informed of any sessions that required his participation. He folded the letter once, precisely, along its original crease. He had known, when Hagrid was summoned, that this was where it would go. He had known before that if he was honest with himself about the sequence, and he was trying, these days, to be more honest with himself about sequences, he had made a decision in November of 1981 that had seemed, at the time, both necessary and correct, and the necessity and the correctness had not changed, and the decision still stood, and its consequences were still unfolding, 14 years later, in a ministry inquiry room, 2 floors below street level, in the testimony of a man who had never told a deliberate lie in his life. He tucked the letter away, put on the expression he wore in corridors when there were students about, and went to be the headmaster. She had been watching him for 3 weeks, not in the way she had watched on that street in November of 1981. That had been surveillance, formal and still, 8 hours as a cat on a cold wall. This was different. This was Harry Potter in the 3rd desk from the left in her Transfiguration classroom, working with the focused quietness he had developed over 5 years, and never quite looking at her when he handed in work, and never quite meeting her eyes during instruction. He was not avoiding her. She did not think he was consciously doing anything at all. He had simply rearranged the room in his attention, the way people rearranged furniture when they did not know what else to do with a space. She had not approached him. She had told herself she was waiting for the right moment, which was the kind of thing people told themselves when they were afraid and did not yet know what to say. On the 24th of September, she stepped through the flue in her office and arrived in the Ministry of Magic with her robes intact and her square spectacles straight on her nose and her hands absolutely steady, and she walked through the atrium and down the correct corridor to the inquiry room, and she sat down in the chair across from Amelia Bones, and she began. She described the 1st of November, 1981, without euphemism. She had spent that day watching the Dursleys' street, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, in cat form, 8 hours or very nearly. She had watched the Dursleys come and go. She had watched the neighbours come and go. She had formed her assessment of the family into which Dumbledore intended to place the child, and the assessment had not been favourable. The Dursleys were, she said the phrase she had used to Dumbledore that evening, without softening it, the worst sort of muggles. She had told him so. She had been specific. She had listed her objections. And his response? Bones asked. He told me that Harry was to be placed with his mother's sister, that the magical protection it afforded required it, that he was certain it was the right thing. McGonagall's voice was level. I told him it was not right, and he told me, not unkindly, that he had considered it very carefully. She paused. I deferred. Bones made a note. And that evening, you were present at the placement itself? I was. I watched from across the street. Hagrid arrived with Harry on the motorcycle. Professor Dumbledore placed the child on the doorstep with a letter of explanation. Hagrid was considerably distressed. I watched them leave, and then I left myself. She said it plainly, without addition. The plainness was its own indictment, and she was aware of that, and she had decided, some weeks ago, that it was what the record deserved. Bones looked at her for a moment. Professor McGonagall, in the 14 years between November 1981 and the present date, did you, at any point, take any action with respect to Harry Potter's welfare at 4 Privet Drive? No. You made no informal inquiry, sent no correspondence, raised no concern with any ministry department? No. To Dumbledore, after that initial conversation, did you raise the matter again? I did not. She did not look away from Bones. I returned to Hogwarts. Harry Potter came to Hogwarts 9 years later, and I met him on the 1st of September, 1991, on the same footing as any other first-year student. I knew his background. I said nothing of it to him. I assigned him Seeker in his first year, and I was proud of how he flew, and I did not revisit the other matter. Bones was very still. Why not? Why did you not report your concerns in November 1981, or at any subsequent point? It was the question Minerva McGonagall had been sitting with since August. She had turned it over many times and examined it from several directions, and she had arrived, each time, at the same answer, which was the true one, and also the one that cost the most to say aloud. Because I trusted that Dumbledore had reasons I was not fully informed of, she said. I had deferred to his judgment for 30 years. In November of 1981, I deferred again. I believed he had weighed it. I believed the protection was necessary, and that he was managing Harry's welfare within whatever constraints that protection imposed. I told myself. She stopped. I told myself he was watching, that it was in hand. I didn't verify that. Bones wrote for quite a long time. Thank you, Professor McGonagall, she said finally. I may have written follow-up questions. McGonagall stepped back through the flue at 11:30, and the Hogwarts office fire went to its normal low burn, and she sat down in the chair she had occupied for 30 years and looked at the window for a while, and then she went to teach a third-year class, and she did not have lunch, and in the afternoon she marked essays, and she did not speak to anyone who did not strictly require it, and at dinner she sat at the high table and watched Harry Potter eat without appetite 3 tables away. She had been trying to find the right moment for 2 weeks. She understood now that the right moment was the one she made. She found him 12 days later, on a Thursday evening, after Transfiguration had ended and his classmates had filed out, and he had taken slightly too long to pack his bag. She did not know whether that had been intentional on his part. She suspected it had been. "Mr. Potter," she said, "if you have a moment." He stayed. He stood on his side of the desks, and she came around to the front of the room and stood near the window, and the light was low and late and gold on the stone floor, and there was nobody else in the room or the corridor outside. "I gave my testimony to the inquiry," she said. "I expect you know that." "Yes. I want you to know what I told them." She could have said it more carefully, with more preamble. She had spent 2 weeks finding words that felt gentler, and she had put them all aside this morning and decided that what the situation required was not gentle words, but honest ones. "I told them that I was at Privet Drive on the night you were left there. I told them that I had known the family was unsuitable. I told them that I said so, and then I left you there anyway, and I never raised the matter again." Harry was looking at her. He had his mother's eyes. She had thought that the first time she met him, and she thought it now, and it was not easier to think than it had been. "Did you know?" he said. "Before. Did you know what it was like?" "Not the specifics," she said. "I knew what I had seen of the family in one day's observation. I knew enough to object. I did not know." She stopped. "I did not ask. After that night, I did not ask." He was quiet. She said, "I'm sorry, Harry." She did not say his name to students as a rule. It was an informality she normally regarded as imprecision. "I should have done more than object once and then defer. That was—" She did not reach for a word that softened it. "That was not enough." He stood there for a moment, and she watched him try to work out what you said when a professor gave you something you had not known how to ask for, and also could not now undo. "You were there," he said, finally. "Before I was even a year old, you were there." "Yes," she said, "I was." The room held that for a moment. Neither of them moved. She did not say Dumbledore's name. She had almost, twice, almost said, "I trusted him." Almost said, "He told me it was managed." And she had stopped herself both times because it was true, and also because it was a thing she could say later, in private to herself, and it did not belong in this room. Harry was 15 years old, and he was owed a conversation that did not spend itself on explanations. He nodded eventually. A single, slow nod, the kind that meant he was filing something rather than dismissing it. "Thank you for telling me," he said. It came out more formal than she thought he meant it. "You're welcome." She meant it. He picked up his bag and left, and she stood at the front of the empty classroom until she heard his footsteps fade down the corridor, and then she went to sit at her desk and did not do anything in particular for a while. The notification arrived on a Thursday, folded into the standard ministry envelope with the DMLE seal, addressed to Harry Potter, care of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and it sat on his plate at breakfast between the marmalade and his charms essay until Hermione told him he was staring at it. He was not a witness against anyone, the letter said. The inquiry simply wished to hear his account of his years at 4 Privet Drive. He was the subject of the placement the inquiry was examining, and his account was relevant to its conclusions. He could bring a responsible adult if he wished. The session was scheduled for the 14th of October at 10 in the morning. He read it 3 times. He put it in his bag. He went to Charms. He did not know what to do with being asked. He had spent 15 years not being asked, by teachers who noticed things and looked away, by neighbors who presumably had eyes, by every adult in his life who had passed through and decided the particular quality of his existence was not their concern. He was used to not being asked. He had built a considerable amount of himself around not being asked. Being asked by an official ministry inquiry, in writing, on department parchment, was something he had no prior experience of, and therefore no prepared response to, and he spent most of the following week not thinking about it, which meant he thought about it constantly. He went alone. The inquiry room was smaller than he had expected, and quieter than courtroom 10, and nothing like the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, or the Transfiguration classroom, or any of the other rooms in which he regularly had to demonstrate things about himself. It had a table, 2 chairs on one side, and 1 chair on the other, a lamp, and a scribe in the corner who was not Percy Weasley, and who Harry did not recognize. Amelia Bones was already seated. She looked the same as she had in courtroom 10, monocle, steady eyes, a stack of parchment aligned to the table's edge. "Mr. Potter," she said, "thank you for coming. Please sit down." She said it again, at the end of the introduction. She was not asking him to testify against anyone. She wanted his account. She would ask questions, and he should answer as completely as he could. And if a question was too difficult, he should say so, and they could return to it or set it aside. Harry said he understood, and she began. She asked him about his living situation at 4 Privet Drive, where he had slept, what his day-to-day arrangements had been. "I slept in the cupboard under the stairs," he said, "until I was 11. Bones's quill stilled briefly. The scribe continued writing. "The cupboard," she said, "under the stairs, for the first 11 years of your life." "Yes." He said it the way he said most things about the Dursleys, plainly, because it was just what had been. He had never thought of it as particularly dramatic. It was simply where he had slept. There was a camp bed in there, and a shelf where I kept my things. They moved me to Dudley's second bedroom the summer before I started Hogwarts. Why then? The Hogwarts letters. He thought she might already know this from other testimony, but she was asking, so he continued. "The letters were addressed to me, to my specific room. They said, 'I remember,' because Uncle Vernon read one out before he could stop himself. They said, 'The cupboard under the stairs.' And he was worried, I think, that someone would see." The scribe's quill moved without pause. Bones made a note of her own. "The letters knew," she said, not quite to Harry, in the tone of someone confirming something to themselves. "I suppose Hogwarts knew," Harry said, "where I actually was." She asked him about his clothes. He described Dudley's cast-offs, trousers with the waist belted up 4 inches, shirts that hung to his knees, a coat that belonged to a boy who was double his size, and who wore it deliberately to avoid anything that might be shared. He said it without particular feeling, because he had never had another frame of reference for clothing until he had his Hogwarts things, and by then he had already formed the habit of not dwelling on what the frame of reference had been. She asked him about his parents, what he had been told about them. "I was told my father was unemployed and that they died in a car crash when I was a baby," he said. "I was told my father was a drunk. I was told not to ask questions about them. Were those instructions clear?" "Very clear." "And did you comply?" He looked at her. "You could get punished for not complying." He said it matter-of-factly. "So, yes, I learned not to ask," Bones wrote. The room had a particular quality Harry was beginning to notice, a kind of density, the air of a place where a lot of careful attention was being paid to things he said without emphasis, and had never thought to emphasize. "Mr. Potter," she said after a pause, "growing up, did you know that anyone in the wizarding world knew where you were?" He thought about it. "No. Not until I got the Hogwarts letter. That was the first time I knew. That there was something outside of the Dursleys, I mean. That someone out there had my address. No contact at all before that? No one you remember?" He started to say no, and then he stopped. "There was Mrs. Fig," he said. "She used to mind me sometimes, when the Dursleys went out or took Dudley somewhere. I didn't like going much. She'd show me photographs of her cats. He used to sit on a lumpy sofa and look at them." He paused. "I didn't know then that she was... I only found out at the hearing in August that she'd been watching for Dumbledore." Bones looked at him for a moment. "She was watching out for you," she said. "And she was made to seem dull so you wouldn't try to seek her company, so you'd stay where she could observe you." He hadn't thought about it in quite those terms. "I suppose so," he said. "And you had no idea?" "No." She made a note. She looked at her parchment. She looked at Harry again, in the manner of someone deciding something, and then she set her quill down "I think," she said, "that covers the main questions for today. I may have written follow-up, but we've been going for some time, and I don't want to—" She stopped, started again. "I want to be careful not to ask more than is useful for the record." He understood that she was ending the session earlier than she'd intended. He wasn't sure whether that was consideration or something else. He stood and gathered his jacket from the back of the chair. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Potter," Bones said. He hadn't been thanked for anything by anyone at the Ministry before, apart from clearing himself of a criminal charge. He didn't know what to do with it, and he didn't examine it. Ron and Hermione were waiting at the Hogwarts gates when he arrived back that afternoon. Ron with his arms crossed against the October cold, and Hermione with her bag over both shoulders and the particular expression she wore when she was worried about him, and had decided to let him speak first. "How was it?" Ron asked. "Fine," Harry said. "What did they ask?" "Just what it was like. Growing up, what the house was like." He shrugged. "Bones she was all right about it. She didn't push." He walked between them through the gates and up the path, and for a while no one said anything, and Ron looked at Hermione over Harry's head in the way he did when he was checking whether she was going to say something, and Hermione didn't say anything. She walked alongside Harry with her hands in her pockets and occasionally glanced at his face and made no comment on what she found there. He didn't tell them everything. He told himself it was because there wasn't much to tell. It was a short session, a formal room, a woman with a quill, and he thought Hermione probably knew that wasn't the whole of it, and she said nothing about it. 2 floors below street level in a ministry office that smelled of old parchment and recent damp, Cornelius Fudge was reviewing the inquiry's latest correspondence and finding the experience distinctly unwelcome. The Harry Potter who had emerged from this inquiry's proceedings, in Fig's testimony, in McGonagall's testimony, and now in the boy's own account, which the DMLE summary had summarized in 3 devastating paragraphs, was sympathetic, quietly, thoroughly sympathetic. A boy in a cupboard, a boy in hand-me-down clothes, a boy who had not known anyone was watching him. That was not the Harry Potter Fudge needed. He needed the Harry Potter who was dangerous, deluded, politically useful as a cautionary case. He had been shaping that version since the end of term. This inquiry was unshaping it, one session at a time. He turned the problem over in his mind and could not immediately find the angle, which was unusual for him, and which he did not intend to report to anyone. He put the summary aside and rang for his afternoon tea and told himself he would think of something. The letter from the DMLE arrived on a Wednesday morning, and Sirius read it at the kitchen table while the house was still quiet enough to hear the pipes. It was formal and precise in the manner of ministry correspondence that had been reviewed by several layers of bureaucracy before being sent. The inquiry was reviewing, it said, the question of why Harry James Potter had not been placed with his designated godfather following the deaths of his parents. Whatever records or accounts existed regarding Mr. Black's situation on the night of the 1st of November, 1981, and subsequently, were requested. Given the particular circumstances of Mr. Black's legal status, the inquiry understood that formal testimony might not be possible. Written submissions would be accepted and formally noted. He put the letter down. He picked up his tea. He put his tea down. His legal status. That was the phrase they had used, the particular circumstances of his legal status, which was the official way of saying, "You are a convicted murderer. Your conviction has never been formally overturned, and you are currently a wanted fugitive whose face has been on ministry posters for 2 years. He was accustomed to his legal status being the end of the conversation. What was new was the inquiry acknowledging it and asking him to submit something anyway. He was still sitting at the table when Lupin came in from the garden, where he had been doing something Sirius had not inquired about, because Lupin's solitary morning activities in the garden were one of the uncomplicated things left in both their lives, and he was not going to subject them to scrutiny. "They're asking for my account," Sirius said. He passed the letter across the table. Lupin read it standing. He folded it carefully and put it back on the table, then pulled out a chair and sat down. "In writing," Lupin said, "because I can't go in person. No. And even in writing, it's a submission, not testimony. It won't be sworn. It won't carry the same weight." "It will be in the record," Lupin said. "In a ministry document, in a context that is not a fugitive warrant. That's not nothing." Sirius looked at the letter. "Will you write it?" "I'll tell you what to say." Lupin got up without comment and fetched parchment and a quill from the desk in the corner. This was the kitchen that had accumulated by now, the sediment of a domestic life neither had planned, and sat back down and dipped the quill and waited. The dictation took 2 hours. The difficulty was not the facts. The facts were clear and had been clear for 14 years, living inside him in the particular compressed form of things that cannot be spoken officially. The difficulty was translating them into the register required. Ministry language, plain and procedural, stripped of the feelings that had accumulated in every sentence over a decade in Azkaban and 2 years on the run. He had to say, "I offered to take the child on the night of the 1st of November, 1981. I was refused." He had to say, "I was taken into ministry custody on the 2nd of November, 1981, and imprisoned in Azkaban without trial." He had to say each of these things in the order that made them comprehensible, without the 12 years of cold and dark that stood between them and the present moment. Lupin wrote each sentence, as Sirius gave it, in his careful, precise hand. He did not flinch at any of it. He had known all of it for 2 years and had, before that, believed the wrong version of it for 12. He wrote what Sirius said, and when Sirius stopped mid-sentence and had to find the words again, Lupin waited, quill still, without hurry, and Sirius found the words. The account said, "He had lent his motorcycle to Hagrid on the evening of the 31st of October, 1981, because Hagrid needed it to retrieve Harry from Godric's Hollow. He had arrived at Godric's Hollow himself, shortly after Hagrid. He had offered to take the child. He was the godfather. It was his right. He had been named as such formally, and had understood it to carry weight. Hagrid had told him no. Dumbledore's orders. Harry was to go to his aunt and uncle at 4 Privet Drive. Sirius had handed over the motorcycle, and Hagrid had gone, and then Sirius had gone after Peter Pettigrew, and that had ended as it had ended, and by the morning of the 2nd of November, he was in a ministry holding cell. The murders of Peter Pettigrew and 12 muggles were attributed to him by Bartemius Crouch without trial, and he was sent to Azkaban. He had been there until 1993. His legal status had not subsequently been resolved. He stopped. He looked at the window. "That's it," he said. "That's the account." Lupin read back what he had written. Sirius confirmed it. Lupin sanded the parchment and folded it once and put it in the envelope and wrote Amelia Bones, Director, Department of Magical Law Enforcement, on the outside, in the hand that had been his professional tool for years. "I'll take it this afternoon," Lupin said. Sirius nodded. He picked up his tea again. It was cold. Remus Lupin walked to the ministry through the October afternoon, which was grey and faintly damp, and smelled of London in autumn in the way that had not changed in 35 years of knowing this city. He had the envelope in his coat pocket. He was 35 years old, which felt both younger and older than he expected, depending on the day. He had known Harry Potter since the boy was born, had visited the house in Godric's Hollow, had been young then and optimistic enough to believe the war would end, and things would go back to what they were. They had not gone back. He could not submit his own testimony. He had known where Harry was, and had known the conditions there, broadly, through order channels, and had said nothing to any ministry authority. If he appeared before the inquiry as a witness, that would surface. He was choosing not to think about that too carefully today. Today his job was to carry Sirius's words to a building Sirius could not enter, and deliver them to a woman who would know what to do with them. He gave the envelope to a DMLE clerk at the reception desk, identified himself, and waited while the clerk confirmed the delivery in writing, which gave him a receipt. He was carrying a receipt for a fugitive's written submission when he walked back out into the grey October afternoon, and he put it carefully in his coat pocket and began the walk home. Amelia Bones read the submission in her office that evening with the door closed. She read it twice and made notes. At the top she wrote, "Submission, Sirius Orion Black, received 3rd November 1995, legal status unresolved, not sworn testimony." Then she sat with it for a while. A child whose parents were murdered on the 31st of October, 1981. A godfather who had been on the scene that same night, willing and named, and asking to take the child. A godfather who was imprisoned without trial on the following morning, and a specific man, whose name was now woven through every piece of testimony in this inquiry, who had made a unilateral decision in the days after, and placed the child with a Muggle family, and monitored the situation for 14 years through a network of people who had all, individually, said nothing. She knew what she had to do next. She had known it since Hagrid's testimony. She had been building toward it with each session, letting the record fill in, letting the sequence of choices become visible, so that when she asked the question, it would be asked in the context of everything that surrounded it. She picked up her quill and began drafting the summons for Albus Dumbledore. Lupin got back to Grimmauld Place at 6:30. Sirius was in the kitchen, where he had been, more or less, since the morning. The letter was gone from the table. "They received it," Lupin said. "Formal confirmation." He put the receipt on the table. Sirius looked at it. His name on ministry parchment in a context that was not a warrant. Even the submission receipt, even the thin paper trail of delivery, was different from anything the ministry had produced about him in 14 years. "What happens now?" he said. Lupin sat down. He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to answer questions that mattered. "I don't know," he said. "But she's building something. The pieces are all in the record. I think she has enough to summon Dumbledore." Sirius was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. And then, "I want to be there." "I know," Lupin said. "You can't." "I know," Sirius said. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the London night had settled in around the house, and the house had closed around them both in the way it did, heavy and old and full of things that had happened here before either of them. And Sirius Black sat in it and waited for whatever the record would do next with his name. Albus Dumbledore moved through the Ministry of Magic on the morning of the 7th of November, with his silver hair and his half-moon spectacles, and the particular unhurriedness of a man who had decided he would not rush. He had been Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot until Fudge stripped that title in June, on the grounds that Dumbledore was using institutional positions to undermine the Ministry's authority. He had not contested it. There were enough hills. Ministry officials he passed in the corridor recognized him and looked quickly away. The inquiry room was exactly as it had been described to him, small, functional, a table and chairs and a lamp that illuminated without warmth. Amelia Bones was already seated. He had known Amelia Bones for many years across various formal contexts, and he respected her more than he respected most people in public life, which was relevant because what he was about to do in this room required saying true things to someone he could trust to do something with them. He sat down. He had decided on the train of thought that carried him through the flu and into the ministry that morning that he would not be evasive. He was 114 years old. He had been evasive about many things for many decades, and there had generally been reasons, and some of those reasons were still operative, and he was nonetheless going to sit in this room and say what was true. Bones introduced the session formally and began. She asked him about the bond of blood protection. He had anticipated this, and he was glad of it. It was the right place to start, because it was the place where his reasoning had begun, and it provided the necessary architecture for everything that followed. He explained it without notes. Lily Potter had died for her son. That act of deliberate sacrifice had generated a protection anchored in blood, her sister's blood. If Harry could call the house of his mother's blood kin his home, the protection would hold against the darkest magic until he came of age. It required Petunia Dursley to take the child in, and Harry to remain there until 17, in return for a protection Dumbledore had judged the strongest available. He watched Bones make notes. She asked clarifying questions, precise, technical, the questions of someone who had done her preparation, and he answered them fully. So the protection required the placement at 4 Privet Drive, she said, when she had finished with the mechanics. It required Harry to live in the home of his mother's blood relative. Yes, Petunia Dursley was the only living candidate. The protection required that Petunia Dursley take the child in. Yes. And once she had taken the child in, Bones said, what did the protection require after that? He looked at her. He had known, when she asked the first question, that this was the second question. He had prepared for it. Preparing for it had not made it easier. The protection required Harry to be able to call the house his home, to have a genuine attachment to it as the place he returned to. Beyond that, the charm's requirements pertained to the nature of the domestic arrangement, not to its quality. So the bond of blood required that Harry live in that house, Bones said. It did not require that he live in a cupboard. No, Dumbledore said. It did not require that. It did not require that he be given his cousin's cast-off clothes. No. It did not require that he be underfed or forbidden to ask questions about his deceased parents or kept ignorant of his own history. No. The word was very quiet. What the charm required, Bones said, and her voice was even and unhurried and had the quality of something that had been waiting in the room for several weeks, was the placement. What happened within that placement was the decision of the people inside that house and the decision of the people who were watching. Dumbledore did not speak immediately. He was aware that the silence was its own kind of answer, and he did not attempt to fill it quickly. Yes, he said. That is correct. He had a reason, a specific, concrete reason that superseded the arguments about conditions and alternatives, one he had carried alone for 14 years. He tried. There were, he said carefully, broader considerations that shaped my decisions about Harry's situation, threats of a nature that made a degree of secrecy and protective isolation seem necessary. The fewer people who knew, Professor Dumbledore, Bones said. I need to ask you directly whether you are referring to a threat that this inquiry and this ministry officially recognize. He looked at her across the table. She looked back. She was not unsympathetic. She was also not going to write an unacknowledged threat into an official ministry record on his authority alone. I understand, he said. And he did. There was nothing he could say in this room, under these circumstances, with this ministry, that would make the reason admissible. He was asking her to trust something the ministry had officially decided was false, and that was not a thing he could compel. He let it go. He had made the argument to Fudge in June, and it had not landed. He was not going to try to make it land here. Bones looked at her parchment. She asked 2 more clarifying questions, and then she set her quill down flat and looked at him. "Did you know," she said, "about the cupboard?" The room was very quiet. He had known this question was in the room since she began. He had felt it all morning, the way you felt a thing you had decided not to avoid. He had carried a version of this question inside himself for 14 years, in the less formal manner of private self-examination, and he had found answers that satisfied him at the time, and didn't satisfy him now. "Yes," he said. "I was aware of the nature of Harry's living arrangements. I was aware they were not—" He stopped. He looked for the precise word. "Not ideal," he said. The phrase sat in the room between them. Not ideal. He could hear how it sounded. He was a man who had spent a century using language with precision, and the gap between what the phrase described and what it euphemized was not a gap he was unaware of. He had said it because it was the true official language for what he had permitted, and he let it stand. Bones looked at her parchment for a moment without writing. "Professor Dumbledore," she said, "did you consider alternatives? Within the existing protective framework, without removing Harry from the Dursley home, were there steps you could have taken to improve the conditions of his placement?" He took his time with this. He owed her his full attention to the question. "I considered," he said, "that Harry's experience of difficulty might be, in some sense, formative. That a childhood without certain comforts or protections from hardship would prepare him for what lay ahead in ways that a more sheltered upbringing might not. I believed, and I am telling you what I believed, not what I would defend today, that a degree of hardship had value." He heard the words as they left him. He had thought them many times. They had always, in his own consideration, been accompanied by a weight of context that made them comprehensible. In this room, stripped of context, they could not enter. They sat alone, and sounded like what they were. "I see," Bones said. She wrote. He did not look away. "I want the record to be clear on one matter," he said, when she had finished writing. "Professor McGonagall and Mrs. Fig acted under my direction. Any conclusions the inquiry draws regarding the silences maintained by people with knowledge of Harry's situation should be drawn regarding me. They trusted my judgment. The responsibility for what that judgment produced lies here." She looked at him for a moment. "The record will reflect your statement," she said. He nodded. He looked at his hands on the table and thought about a boy on a doorstep in the dark in November of 1981, and the choices he had made in the years after, each reasonable in the context of the last. He was certain, sitting in this room, that he had been wrong about the cupboard, and that "not ideal" was a phrase that would follow him for whatever years he had left, and that he deserved it. "Thank you for your time, Professor Dumbledore," Bones said. He rose and said he was available for any further questions, and he meant it. She thanked him. He walked back through the ministry and into the cold November air above, stood a moment with the grey London sky overhead, and went back to Hogwarts. The evidence, laid out on Amelia Bones's desk in the second week of November, occupied 4 parchment folders and a supplementary stack that had begun as a neat pile and was no longer. She worked through it in the evenings, after the office had emptied. She had spent 30 years in DMLE learning to read a case the way you read a map, not feature by feature but all at once, looking for the shape of the thing. The shape of this one was becoming very clear. The bond of blood protection was a legitimate defense for the placement itself. Ancient magic, well documented, requiring the child to be placed in the home of his mother's blood relative. That requirement had been real, and it provided a genuine rationale for the decision made on the 1st of November, 1981. What it did not provide a rationale for was everything after. The charm required a home. It did not specify a cupboard. It required that Petunia Dursley take the child in. It said nothing about the quality of care she then provided, the conditions within the placement, the clothes, the food, the room, the restrictions on speech. None of that was the charm. All of that was a choice. Bones opened the clean folder on her left and began drafting the formal inquiry letters. She sent them to every department with any plausible mandate touching on the welfare of minors or oversight of magical individuals in Muggle households, requesting any records of contact with Harry James Potter at 4 Privet Drive between the 1st of November, 1981 and the 1st of September, 1991. All records, any records, no matter how informal. The responses arrived over the following 10 days. There were no records, not a memo, not a routine check. Not a single notation in any departmental file indicating that anyone in the Ministry of Magic had, at any point in that 10-year window, inquired as to the welfare of the most famous child in Wizarding Britain. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures had a more extensive filing system for blast-ended scroots than the Ministry possessed regarding Harry Potter. There was no child welfare authority. There never had been. The wizarding world had never built one. The absence that had existed around Harry was not the absence of enforcement. It was the absence of anything that might have been enforced. She put the responses in the supplementary stack and wrote, at the top of a fresh page, "The Ministry of Magic maintained no oversight of Harry Potter's welfare at any point during his childhood. No department, no visit, no file." Then she sent a courtesy notification to the minister's office. Cornelius Fudge received it on a Friday morning, and his first thought was that there had been a mistake, and his second thought, arriving approximately 3 seconds later, was a considerably colder one. He had been watching this inquiry with the patience of a man who believed the rope was being paid out in a useful direction. Dumbledore had placed Harry Potter in circumstances now officially described in the inquiry record as not ideal. He had admitted it himself, and the phrase had been circulating in the corridors in the way damaging phrases did. And Fudge had seen a narrative in which Dumbledore's unilateral, unsupervised decisions had failed the wizarding world's most important child. That narrative had served him. It suggested the Ministry needed more oversight of Dumbledore, more centralized control. The departmental responses had just dismantled that narrative completely. He could not frame the findings as Dumbledore's failure without framing them as the Ministry's failure. Every department that had never checked on Harry Potter operated under his administration. He had been minister since 1990. The absence of oversight was not Dumbledore's invention. It was systemic, and now formally documented. He was still working through the implications when his secretary announced that Amelia Bones had requested a meeting. She sat in the chair across from his desk with her monocle and her parchment and her characteristic refusal to be hurried. "Cornelius," she said, "I want to raise one point before you read the full preliminary summary. I anticipate a question about framing. The inquiry," he said carefully, "has produced some significant evidence of Dumbledore's unilateral overreach in this matter." "The inquiry has produced significant evidence," Bones said, "that one individual made decisions without Ministry oversight. It has also produced significant evidence that the Ministry had no mechanism to provide oversight even if it had wished to. Those are two separate findings, I will be presenting both. Could the report not be structured to foreground the question of individual responsibility? Cornelius. She said it very quietly. The ministry exercised no authority over this child's welfare for 14 years. That is in the record. I will not structure the report to make it less visible. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. She had been in DMLE for 30 years, and she was not going to move, and he had always known that about her, and he found that he had no further argument that wouldn't make the conversation worse. The letter arrived at Hogwarts on the 12th of December, addressed in Bones's handwriting and sealed with the DMLE seal. Harry read it in the corridor outside the owlery, standing with his coat open because he had not anticipated being outside for long. It was brief and clear. The bond of blood protection had been formally documented. The inquiry had verified its mechanics and its ongoing requirements. She was not, she wrote, in a position to remove Harry from his aunt's home without threatening a protection that she considered essential to his safety. She would not do that. She was aware of the nature of the threat that made the protection necessary. She wrote this carefully, in her precise handwriting, in a letter that would have been deeply inconvenient for the ministry's official position to read, and she was not prepared to compromise his safety for the inquiry's convenience or anyone else's. The inquiry, she wrote, would continue. Its findings would address the conditions of his placement and the responsibilities of the individuals who had known and said nothing. But Harry would remain at 4 Privet Drive for the summer months. She was sorry that this was the answer. He read it twice. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. He found Ron and Hermione in the common room that evening and told them. Ron listened with his arms crossed, and the expression he wore when he was angry about something and was waiting to find out what was the right thing to be angry at. Hermione listened with her hands in her lap and her eyes on Harry's face. "She's right," Hermione said, when he had finished, "about the protection. Given everything." She stopped. "I think it's fair, and I think it's deeply unfair, both at the same time." Harry said nothing. He looked at the fire. "Harry," Ron said. "I know," Harry said. He didn't say anything else, and after a while Ron stopped trying to find a thing to say, and Hermione didn't say anything more either, and they sat there in the warmth of the common room while the fire moved, and it was enough for now to just sit there. The inquiry's progress summary reached Grimmauld Place through Lupin, who had his own careful channels, on a Thursday evening. Sirius read through the summary standing at the kitchen counter, turning the pages methodically. He stopped at the section documenting the ministry's departmental responses. He read it once. He put it down. He picked it up and read it again. No records, no contact, no oversight. 10 years of Harry Potter, living 2 streets from a squib who had been watching him on Dumbledore's instructions, and the Ministry of Magic had no file on him. The most famous child in the wizarding world, and the ministry had not checked once. Sirius had been in Azkaban from November of 1981 until 1993. The ministry had arranged it. They had known where he was for 12 years, because they had put him there without trial, and never sent anyone to ask questions. No records of review, no mechanism that might have caught it. He had been a name in a file in a cell, and the file had said murderer, and the file had not been questioned. He put the summary down on the counter. The ministry had not checked on Harry. The ministry had not checked on him. The absence, it turned out, was not selective. It was simply what they did. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, not quite knowing what to do with a symmetry that was true but did not improve anything, and eventually he put the kettle on, because it was something to do with his hands. By December, the inquiry had become a background condition of Harry's life, the way a noise you cannot locate becomes part of the air. He received occasional letters from Bones, formal, precise, keeping him informed of procedural developments in the manner she had established from the beginning. He read them and wrote brief acknowledgements and put them in the box under his bed where he kept the things he was not ready to discuss. He had mostly stopped talking to people about it. Not because it had stopped mattering, but because there was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from having your childhood treated as evidence, and he had reached it somewhere around November, and he had not found the other side of it yet. He was sitting in the corridor, outside the portrait hole, on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of December, after most of the castle had emptied for the holidays, when Neville sat down next to him. He did not say anything immediately. Neville had a quality Harry had noticed over 5 years of sharing a dormitory. He approached difficult things the way a person approached a patch of ice, carefully and from the side, and then once he had decided to cross it, he crossed it without stopping. He sat down, adjusted the strap of his bag, and then said, "I heard they're doing an inquiry about where you grew up." "Yeah," Harry said. "I heard it was. That there were some things." He didn't specify. He was looking at the wall across the corridor rather than at Harry. "I just wanted to say, I don't know. I don't think I have anything useful to say. I just wanted to sit here for a bit, if that was all right." Harry said it was all right. They sat. The corridor was cold and quiet in the way corridors were when most of the castle was elsewhere, and the torches in their brackets made sounds that were usually covered by the noise of students. After a while, Neville said, "Gran took me to see them last Christmas. Mum and Dad. She takes me every year." He said it without particular setup. "They're at St. Mungo's, Janus Thicky Ward. They've been there since I was a baby. They'll be there forever." "I know," Harry said. And he did. He had known for 2 years, since the night in the hospital wing when he had heard Neville's name under Veritaserum and put something together that had always been vague in the edges. "I know. I'm sorry. Gran chose to take me," Neville said. "She didn't have to. Legally it would have. There might have been other arrangements. But she wanted to. She told me once. She sat me down when I was about 7, and she told me she wanted me there." Harry looked at the wall. "She's hard on me," Neville said. She expects a lot. She sends howlers." He said this without bitterness, just accuracy. "But she chose. That's different." There was a long pause. "No one reviewed your placement either," Harry said. "I found that out from the inquiry. No ministry body, no formal check, nothing." "No," Neville agreed. "No one did." And then, quietly, "But I had her, so it mattered differently." That was it. That was the exact shape of it, and Harry did not know what to do with the shape, except sit with it, because it was both true and not enough, and it didn't go anywhere. It just sat there. They stayed in the corridor for a long time after that, not talking about anything in particular. Neville showed Harry a plant care note he'd been writing for a mandrake he was worried about. Harry looked at it and said he thought it sounded right, though he had no idea. The torches moved. The castle settled. At some point they got cold enough that they went inside. Minerva McGonagall had come from her office, looking for a 3rd year. She had asked to return some borrowed equipment, and had taken what she thought was the long way, because the short way was being repainted. She heard them from the end of the corridor. She stopped before she came around the corner. She stood, out of their line of sight, and listened to the voices, Harry's and the one she recognized after a moment as Longbottom's, and she didn't go in. She stood there for longer than she would have expected. The conversation was quiet and unhurried, and didn't go anywhere resolvable, and she listened to it until it reached the natural end that conversations like this reached, and then she heard them get up and go inside, and she stood in the empty corridor, alone. She had been at Hogwarts the night Harry Potter arrived for his first term. She had put him on the stool under the sorting hat and watched him placed in Gryffindor, and felt something she had not examined carefully at the time, because there were 80 other students to sort, and a feast to oversee, and a new school year beginning, and there would always be more time to examine it. She walked to her office. She sat at her desk. She looked at the window, which showed the grounds in the December dark, and she thought about 14 years of September terms, Harry arriving each year with that same slight frame, that same careful way of holding himself, the robes that had been right-sized in first year because Hagrid had bought them, and Hagrid had an eye for a child who had never had properly fitting clothes. She had noticed. She had catalogued it with the professional attention of a woman who had been teaching children for 40 years, and knew what fitting clothes meant, and what the absence of them meant. She had said nothing. Not once in 5 years. She had given him house points, and given him detention, and sent him to the hospital wing, and written to his aunt and uncle regarding his guardianship consent forms, and received back the shortest acceptable responses, and noted all of this in the part of her mind that did not connect it to the night she had stood on a dark street in Surrey and said the worst sort of muggles, and then left. She had been thinking, these past months, about the placement, about whether she could have stopped it, whether her objections had carried any weight that might have been further leveraged. She had concluded, honestly, that she could not have stopped it. Dumbledore's reasons had been real. The magic had been real. The requirement had been real. She had not been wrong to defer to the things she genuinely could not overrule. But that was the placement. What she had heard in the corridor tonight was not about the placement. It was about a boy who had grown up without anyone choosing him. Neville Longbottom had a grandmother who had sat him down at 7 and told him she wanted him there. Harry had the Dursleys, and the people who had known the difference had looked at it, each year, and said it was handled, and gone back to their classrooms. She sat with that for a while. She did not try to rearrange it into something more comfortable. She took out a piece of parchment. She was not writing to the inquiry. That was done, the testimony given, the record made. She was not writing to anyone in an official capacity. She was writing to Hagrid, who was somewhere north of the Scottish coast on Dumbledore's errand to the Giants, and who would not receive this for weeks if he received it at all while the mission was ongoing. She did not entirely know why she was writing to Hagrid. He had been there on the night, and had held the baby, and had wept, and had handed the child over, and flown away. She didn't know what she intended to say until her quill was moving. She wrote, "I find myself thinking frequently about the night we left him on the doorstep. I have thought about it since August, which is not the same as saying I didn't think about it before. I told myself it was necessary and correct, and I believed all of that. And I am no longer sure believing it was enough. I sat in a corridor tonight and listened to him talk and did not go in, and I am not sure whether that was the right choice or simply the familiar one." She stopped. She read it back. She folded the parchment and sealed it, and wrote Rubeus Hagrid. "Please hold until return on the envelope, because the Owlery would know what to do with that," and she set it on the corner of her desk. She sat for a while longer, and then she went to correct the 6th-year essays she had been putting off for a week. Hermione found Harry in the common room an hour after he had come in from the corridor. She sat down next to him without asking whether he wanted company, which was usually the right call with Harry, and looked at the fire for a moment before she said anything. "Are you all right?" "Yeah," he said. The word came out the way it always did, quick and automatic and slightly too immediate. She looked at him. "You don't have to keep saying that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I know." Then, "I don't know what I am instead." She nodded, just once. She didn't say anything. She stayed where she was, next to him, in front of the fire, while the common room made its small sounds around them. And that was what she could do. And it was, he thought, something. The session was closed to the press and to the public, and to anyone without a specific reason to be in the room, which meant it contained Amelia Bones, the DMLE's 2 senior investigators, a recording scribe, and Cornelius Fudge, who had insisted on attending and who occupied his chair with the careful stillness of a man who had not yet decided what expression to wear. She had the findings document in front of her. She had written every word of it herself, going over the language with the same attention she gave to anything that would become a permanent ministry record. Some documents were used and filed. Some documents were used and then used again, cited and recited, growing heavier with each reference. She believed this was one of the second kind. She read it aloud, in the manner she read formal findings, clearly, without editorial emphasis, allowing the words to carry what they carried. Regarding the placement of Harry James Potter at 4 Privet Drive on the 1st of November, 1981. The inquiry finds that Professor Dumbledore's decision to place the child with Petunia Dursley via the bond of blood charm was not illegal. No ministry statute existed to regulate such placements. The inquiry recommends that the ministry establish statutory guidance without delay. Fudge made a small movement that was not quite a nod. Regarding the conditions at 4 Privet Drive, the inquiry finds that conditions between November 1981 and at minimum September 1991 were below any standard of reasonable care. Documented, the child slept in a cupboard under the stairs until 11, was consistently underfed, was clothed in ill-fitting hand-me-downs, was forbidden to ask about his deceased parents, grew to 11 with no knowledge of his own history. These facts are now in the ministry's permanent record. The room was quiet. The senior investigators did not change their expressions because they had written portions of this document themselves and already knew what it said. Fudge's face had taken on a quality she recognized from the few times she had seen him genuinely wrong-footed. Regarding Professor Dumbledore's knowledge of conditions at 4 Privet Drive, the inquiry finds that he was aware of Harry Potter's living arrangements and described them, in his own testimony, as not ideal. Alternatives existed within the existing protective framework that were not pursued. Professor Dumbledore is issued a formal censure. This censure is entered in the ministry's permanent record. Regarding Mrs. Arabella Fig, Mrs. Fig acted under direct instruction and within the limits of her assigned role. No censure is issued. Her full cooperation is noted with acknowledgement, and the record reflects that she found her assignment difficult and expressed regret. Regarding the Ministry of Magic, no department, under any minister, has any record of contact with or oversight of Harry Potter at 4 Privet Drive between 1981 and 1991. The inquiry finds this to be a systemic failure. The full findings will be entered in the ministry's permanent record. She paused there, a precise, deliberate pause, and she looked at Fudge. "Point 6, she said. Fudge said, before she could continue, that the ministry's failure in this matter had clearly been shaped by Professor Dumbledore's decision to manage the situation privately, without informing the ministry of the placement's existence or the child's location, and surely the inquiry's findings in this respect should be understood in that context. Minister, Bones said, the ministry's records show no contact with Harry Potter between 1981 and 1991. You have been Minister for Magic since June of 1990. She did not raise her voice. The years 1990 and 1991 fall within your administration. The record reflects that. Fudge stopped. "Point 6, she said again, and continued. Regarding Sirius Black, the inquiry notes without prejudice that Harry Potter's designated godfather was imprisoned without trial on the 2nd of November, 1981, the day after Harry was placed with the Dursley family. The inquiry has no authority to reopen that matter. It is placing this notation in the permanent record as a related matter of documented fact." She set down the document. "The formal censure will be delivered in writing to Professor Dumbledore today," she said. "The full findings are filed. The session is closed." The document arrived at Hogwarts by Ministry Owl that afternoon and was placed on Dumbledore's desk by his deputy in the small silver tray in which he kept formal correspondence. He was alone in the office when he read it. He read it from beginning to end, all 7 sections, and then he set it down on the desk and looked at the window. He had expected it. He had testified honestly, and Bones had built the findings from the testimony in exactly the way he would have expected. A formal censure. His name in a ministry record as someone who had known and hadn't acted. He would carry it. It was not more than he was due. Expecting a thing didn't make it less true. He sat for a while, then put the document in the relevant drawer and went to the staff meeting he had been preparing for. Lupin brought the relevant section to Grimmauld Place that evening, folded and marked. He placed it on the kitchen table in front of Sirius without preamble, and Sirius read it. His name was in the document. Not the name that appeared on wanted posters, not the name that appeared on Azkaban's intake records, not the name that moved through ministry corridors attached to the word murderer as a fixed and unexamined compound. His name was in this document in a sentence that said, "Imprisoned without trial on the 2nd of November, 1981, being the day after Harry was placed with the Dursley family. The inquiry does not have authority to reopen or review Mr. Black's criminal matter." He had known it wouldn't. It couldn't. It was a placement inquiry, not a criminal appeal, and his case was a separate thing that would require a separate process that did not yet exist and might not exist for some time. He had known that going in. It is placing this notation in the permanent record as a related matter of documented fact. He read the sentence 3 more times. He set the page down. He picked up his tea. For 14 years, his name in a ministry document had meant one thing. Now it meant also this. The notification reached Harry on a Thursday in early February. He was on the moving staircase between the 4th and 5th floors when the Hogwarts owl found him. It had apparently been looking, and he unfolded the parchment while the staircase swung slowly toward the west corridor. The inquiry had concluded. Formal findings had been issued, and a summary would follow. He was to be informed that the findings had been entered in the ministry's permanent record. He read it twice. The staircase arrived at the west corridor and stopped. Other students pushed past him with the particular impatience of people who had somewhere to be and found him an obstacle. He stood at the top of the stairs and read the letter again. The inquiry's findings were in the ministry's permanent record. Somewhere in the Ministry of Magic there was now a document that said what the cupboard under the stairs had been, and what it had meant, and who had known, and what they had done about it, which was nothing. He stood there for a while. He was not sure what he had expected to feel. Something had been done, had been completed. Something was now written down that had never been written down before. He did not feel fixed. He did not feel like the thing that had happened to him had been undone. He felt as though something that had existed only inside him had been confirmed to exist outside of him as well. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket and went to Charms. Amelia Bones was alone in her office when the building finally emptied. The lamp on her desk burned down in the particular slow way of lamps in rooms where no one was paying them attention. She thought about the last recommendation in the findings, the one she had added herself in the final section, addressed not to any individual, but to the ministry as an institution. That the ministry establish, without delay, a formal process for overseeing the welfare of wizarding children placed in non-wizarding households, a review board, minimum standards, a mechanism that would catch, in future, what had gone uncaught for 14 years. It would take years to implement, if it was implemented. It would require legislation, departmental restructuring, budget allocation, or the ponderous machinery of ministry reform. She might not see the completed version. She knew how these things moved. She had put it in the record anyway. You put things in the record that were true and that should be done. Whether they were done was a different question. She turned off the lamp. February at Hogwarts was the same as it had always been, which was to say, it was cold and grey, and the castle smelled of stone and torch smoke and the particular damp that seeped in from the lake when the wind came off the water. And Harry Potter was 15 years old and in the middle of his 5th year, and none of that had changed. He had Transfiguration on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and McGonagall called on him by name the way she always had, no differently, no more gently, no acknowledgement in her voice of the fact that they had stood in an empty classroom last autumn and said things neither of them would say in front of anyone else. He had potions twice a week, and Snape marked his work with the same exacting contempt he had maintained since Harry's first year, which was either an expression of rigorous standards or a personal preference, and Harry had long since stopped trying to tell the difference. He had data and care of magical creatures and history of magic, and he ate 3 meals a day in the Great Hall and slept in the dormitory he shared with Ron and Neville and Dean and Seamus, and most of the time Hogwarts felt exactly as it always had, except that somewhere in the Ministry of Magic, in a file in a department, 2 floors below street level, there was a document with his name on it that said what the cupboard under the stairs had been. That said he had slept in it. That said who had known. That said what it meant. It did not fix anything. He was still going back to Privet Drive in the summer. The Dursleys were still the Dursleys, and 4 Privet Drive was still 4 Privet Drive, and none of that was going to change. But the document existed, and he had not existed in documents before, not as a subject, not in a context that asked the question of what had been done to him and who was responsible, and he was still working out what to do with that. Ron asked him about it on the 1st of March, which happened to be Ron's 16th birthday, and which Ron was marking by eating a second piece of the cake Mrs. Weasley had sent, with a great deal of icing in the shape of a Chudley Cannon's logo. Hermione was across the table with a book open beside her plate, reading at the angle that suggested she was pretending to read while actually listening. "Do you feel better?" Ron asked. "Now that it's, done." Harry thought about it. "Not really," he said, "but I feel like it happened. Like it's real now, in a way it wasn't before." He considered the sentence. "I don't know how to explain that better." Ron was quiet for a moment. He broke off another piece of cake. "I think that's something," he said. It came out simply, without the second guessing that usually accompanied Ron's attempts at this kind of thing, and that was what made it land. "Yeah," Harry said. "I think it might be." Hermione turned a page. Neville found him in the corridor outside the library 3 days later. He fell into step beside Harry in the way that had become natural between them since December. Two people who moved at the same pace and did not feel the need to explain the pace. "Gran got a letter," Neville said. "From the Ministry, a courtesy notice, it said, about the inquiry's findings. Something about families of war orphans in extended family care, outreach. Some kind of proposed review." "What did she say?" "She wrote back the same day." Neville's expression carried a specific quality that Harry had come to recognize as fondness wearing the costume of resignation. Very formally, 2 sentences, acknowledged receipt and stated that any statutory review was welcome to consult with her at a mutually agreeable time. He paused. She didn't say she'd actually participate. Harry thought about Augusta Longbottom, who sent howlers and pressured her grandson on family honor, and took him to St. Mungo's every year to visit people who could not recognize him. "But she'll be fine," Harry said. "She'll be fine," Neville agreed. They walked for a moment. "Something was said," Harry said. "That's what it is. Something that hadn't been said before." Neville nodded, once, in the slow way of someone confirming a thing they had already thought. Sirius had read the findings 3 times. The copy Lupin had brought him was worn at the fold from handling, and he had stopped apologizing for the handling, because the fact of it was simply that he had read it 3 times and would probably read it again. He was 36 years old, which still surprised him occasionally. He had spent 12 years not aging in any way that felt real, and his sense of himself as a person who occupied time normally had not entirely recalibrated. He was 36 years old and he was still a fugitive, and the findings had been explicit that they lacked the authority to reopen his case, and nothing about his legal situation had materially changed. His name was in an official ministry document as Harry's godfather. His name was in an official ministry document as a person who had been imprisoned without trial. It was not an exoneration. It was not justice. It was a crack in a wall that he had been pressing against for 14 years, and the wall had not fallen, but the crack was real, and it had not been there before. Lupin came to the kitchen in the evening with 2 cups of tea and sat across from him. He had turned 36 on the 10th of March, which had passed with the minimum of fuss that Lupin preferred for his birthdays, and he looked, not better exactly, but steadier than he had looked in October. He wrapped his hands around his cup. "What comes next?" Sirius asked. Lupin was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of question that required honesty rather than comfort, and Lupin was capable of both and knew which this was. "I don't know," he said. "A legal process eventually. Not this year. This ministry isn't going to reopen your case while Fudge is still trying to manage the inquiry's fallout." He looked at his tea. "But the record is there now. Someone can use the record." "They've always known," Sirius said. "The people who mattered. They've always known I didn't do it." "Yes," Lupin said. "But now they can't say they don't." Sirius thought about that for a while. The kitchen fire made its sounds. The house settled around them, old and heavy and full of history he had spent most of his life trying to put down, and he sat in it and thought about a notation in a ministry document and a wall with a crack in it. "That's enough," he said. He meant it. Just about. It was March at the ministry too, and the days had lengthened enough that there was still light in the sky when Amelia Bones's last meeting ended. She sat at her desk, after the others had gone, and looked at the window, which showed the exterior of the building across the street, and, at the top corner, a thin strip of London evening sky. She had been head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for years. She had filled the greater part of her professional life with cases and findings and decisions made under incomplete information in limited time, and she had learned, over those years, to distinguish between two things that looked similar from the outside: justice and the record of an attempt at justice. Justice was what happened when a wrong was corrected. The record of an attempt at justice was what happened when a wrong was documented and named and placed in an official account where it could be pointed to, even if it could not yet be fixed. The inquiry into Harry Potter's placement had been the latter. She was not ashamed of it. She thought about Edgar. He had been 28 years old when they killed him. He had been a good man, precise and careful, not unlike her, which she had once teased him for, and which she no longer could. He had died in a war that had ended with a child sleeping in a cupboard under a staircase in a Surrey house, while a ministry that was supposed to protect Wizarding Britain had no record of the child's existence and no mechanism to obtain one. She had opened this inquiry for many reasons. Her legal responsibilities were one, her professional standards were another. He was one too. She did not know, could not know, that she had approximately 3 months left. She did not know that the war she believed had ended was not finished. She did not know what summer would bring. She picked up the next file on her desk. There was always a next file. There was always another name, another set of facts to be assessed, another question the record needed to answer. She had spent 30 years believing that the record mattered, and she had not stopped believing it, and she did not intend